I've been getting a lot of questions lately about my new TNG jumpsuit patterns, specifically how they're different from the older versions and what's better about these new ones. And the short answer is
everything.
Don't get me wrong, the older patterns go together fine, look the part, and people have seemed very happy with them, but they were really just my best guess at the time. I was basically just eyeballing it based on screen caps, auction photos, that kind of thing. For these new patterns, I threw the old versions out the airlock, because this time I was able to pattern directly off multiple screen-used uniforms, including 3 hero uniforms and detailed reference photos of another. No eyeballing or guesswork was needed, and I was able to take what I thought were the best qualities of each of these uniforms and sort of amalgamate them into an idealized pattern. My new sewing tutorial is also based directly on how these screen-used uniforms were made, and it's exclusively intended for use with my new patterns. Beyond that, there's not one big thing that's better, but dozens of smaller details that all accumulate into vastly superior new patterns. For anyone interested in some of the finer detailing improvements, here are a few examples. I'd originally thought that the neckline trim on the early uniform style was a 1/4 inch wide, but I've since learned that it was actually 3/16 of an inch. It's a little thing, but you can definitely see a difference. Same with the yoke piping. On the older patterns, I was off a bit with the yoke piping contour. The double curve was a little too exaggerated. It turns out that they were originally patterned a bit straighter, but it was pulled into that gentle double curve by the wearer's body. For example, here's what the yoke piping looked like on the screen-used Tasha Yar uniform I studied while it was lying flat on the table. But here's what it looked like on the dress form. You can see it does that gentle double curve mostly on its own. I'd previously thought that the ideal yoke height at the center front was an even inch, but in light of the screen-used uniforms I studied and the trims only being 3/16 of an inch wide, I now think that 7/8 of an inch looks best. It's another small but noticeable difference. The screen-used uniforms obviously varied wildly though. One of the major pattern improvements is the shape of the yoke itself. I'd originally had the right idea, but I was off a bit with the older patterns. Observe how the lower edge of the yoke gently curved downward away from the center front. Same for the later uniform styles. My older patterns had the lower edge basically straight across most of the front, only dipping downward toward the arms. The shoulders were also a bit too broad in the older patterns. The screen-used uniforms didn't have as much fullness over the shoulder, so with the new patterns I corrected the shape of the shoulder and lower front yoke seams. This definitely helps you achieve that nice, sculpted look over the shoulders. When there's too much fullness over the shoulders or the outer corner is patterned too low, that can cause it to get all warbly. My older patterns included multiple collar options, with 2 different collar heights and tapers, but this time around I simplified things a bit and just included 1. Although the original collars did vary some, both of the jumpsuit collars I studied were the same height. I just streamlined the new pattern a bit. I also had some handy reference photos of the collar and cuffs on a screen-used Yesterday's Enterprise uniform, generously provided by Angelo Cafaldi. My older patterns didn't have the center front collar seam because I didn't know it was there at the time. I've also updated the shape of the sleeve cuffs to be closer to the screen-used costumes. Another major area improved on my new patterns is the waist. On my older patterns, I'd positioned the natural waist flush with where the diagonal seams met on the right side, but it turns out that was a little too high. On the women's uniforms I studied, the natural waist was where the asymmetrical seam crossed at the center front. Here you can see this on the 2 women's hero uniforms. The men's looks like it was a little higher, but not quite as high as on my older patterns. So for these new patterns, the asymmetrical waist paneling is better proportioned, more like the screen-used uniforms. Another neat little detail is that on the original uniforms, the left front waist seam had a subtle curve to it toward the upper corner. This gave it just a little extra flair toward the corner. William Ware Tice loved doing that kind of thing. On my older patterns, this seam was just a straight line, but the newer patterns have this little flare. There was also the gentlest of downward curves on the back. You usually couldn't even see this on the women's jumpsuits, but here you can on the huge Worf uniform. So I've incorporated this into the new patterns too. I do want to quickly point out that all these details varied, of course, with 3 different costume designers who continually tinkered with these uniforms over all the production years. There was some experimentation and lots of details evolved over the course of the show. That's kind of what I meant earlier, about taking what I believe to be the best qualities of each uniform I studied and combining them into one idealized pattern. For example, on the extras uniform I studied, the waist seams were straight lines with no curve on either the front or back. But this was an extras costume, and many of the details on that one lacked the fit and nuance of the hero uniforms. So anyway, making our way downward, there have also been some major patterning improvements to the lower front area. On my older patterns, I'd just started with a skin-tight jumpsuit pattern base, and drawn the seam lines on where I thought they looked about right. Again, eyeballing it. I'd originally drawn these seams as straight lines, but it turns out that they actually had a slight curve to them. On the women's versions, these seams were actually cinched in a bit up toward the waist, functioning like fitting darts. But to maintain the fit and proportions, the side seams need to be let out at the waist by the same amount the lower front seams were taken in. The center front seam was also cinched in a bit up toward the waist. This meant that the asymmetrical waist seam needed to be adjusted on both sides to compensate, so the diagonal contour would flow smoothly across the center front. Fun fact, not adjusting this properly is what caused those weird, double-jointed fronts that occasionally popped up over the years. You have to compensate for that for it to look right. I mean, if you want yours to look like that, then fine, fair enough. There it is, screen used, screen accurate, etc., etc. But personally, I think it looked so much better when the diagonal seam flowed smoothly across the center front. So anyway, that's just a little taste of what I dealt with on these new patterns. You can see the domino effect of even the tiniest alteration impacting all the surrounding body panels. Grading this thing was a nightmare, but I got it done and I'm so happy with these new patterns. Anyway, there's some improvements with the pattern interior as well. On my older patterns, I just used standard 5/8 inch seam allowance everywhere, like most retail patterns do. But I've since learned that Tice, or at least his wardrobe team, had kind of a paradigm they like to use on those early TNG uniforms. The neckline and yoke allowances were usually 3/8 of an inch. The side seam and inseam allowances were usually 5/8 of an inch, and all the other seam allowances were 1/2 an inch except for the zipper areas. They were usually larger, typically ranging from about 3/4 of an inch to a full inch. The sleeve and armscye areas were also simpler than I'd guessed all those years ago with my original patterns. The older patterns had these weird kind of bat wings poking out. I did that because at the time, that's just kind of how the geometry worked out. But the screen-used body panels were simpler and the side panels were just flat across the top. So my new patterns are like this too. Something that hadn't occurred to me with my original patterns was a lower facing at the bottom of the early pant legs, but all the screen-used uniforms I studied had one. I figured the later uniform styles had one, and I was right about that, but the facings on the screen-used costumes were all larger than on my older patterns. My new patterns include a larger facing, and in my new sewing tutorial I go over how to assemble these areas the same ways that the screen-used uniforms were made. And finally, with my older patterns and tutorial, I said to just use whatever raglan shoulder pads you wanted. And while the original uniforms did have raglan-style shoulder padding, the shoulder pads appear to have been custom-made and are a lot bigger than standard retail pads. My new patterns include the actual shoulder pads themselves, and in my new tutorial, I walk you through how to make replica pads to complete the uniform. So that was a quick look at just some of the ways my new TNG jumpsuit patterns are better than the old ones. I've definitely learned a lot in the past 6 or 7 years since my initial research in patterns, and I'm so excited about these new versions. It's all been a colossal amount of effort, and I wouldn't have bothered if I didn't think it was absolutely worth it in the end.
I regret nothing.
I I worked really hard on the original patterns back in 2017, but these new ones blow those out of the water. If you have those, I strongly suggest just chucking them and picking up these new ones instead. I can't emphasize enough how much better they are. Or if you're on the fence, you can read through the free sewing tutorial on my blog, www.startrekcostumeguide.com, and see how it all goes together. You can get these new patterns at www.taylorsgonewild.com. They're available both as physical copies and digital downloads. There are pictures of all the demonstration uniforms I made using these patterns there too. If you didn't already know, for all my sewing patterns, the pattern images are always of costumes that I've actually made, using the exact same sewing pattern customers will receive. I pick up the very first print from my local copy and print shop and use it for the demonstration/tutorial uniforms. It's my final round of quality control. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting and helpful and have a better idea what my new TNG jumpsuit patterns are about. Kapla!